From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Megan Abbott, as probably most of you know, is the queen of noir, the queen of crime fiction. She's an Edgar-winning author of 7 novels, including The End of Everything, The Fever, and most recently, You Will Know Me. Her stories have appeared in multiple collections, including Best American Mystery Stories of 2014 and 2016. She's from the Detroit area. She graduated from the University of Michigan, got her PhD in English and American Literature from NYU, and was the John Grisham Writer-in-Residence of Ole Miss. But better than all of that, Megan Abbott writes about girls and women we probably all feel like we know, and puts them in some pretty harrowing situations. Yes. Please welcome Megan Abbott.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I feel a little bit like Norma Desmond with these lights.
I know.
It's very dramatic.
You can't really see their faces.
Yes, yes.
What expressions they might have on them.
Yes.
But definitely, I would love to start with just women, girls, teenage girls, moms. Yes. This is a world you seem to really love. And I have my own reasons why that might be, but please tell us, why do you want them at the center of your novels?
I guess, and I think, it just sort of happened. It's so interesting that it's sort of specific to write about women. If you're a crime novelist and you write about men, no one says, why do you write about men? But it is weird because historically, in America at least, crime fiction has this reputation for being about men, about the world of men, or at least these traditional male areas of, the police and private detectives and so I was more interested in the sort of mystery of women, especially because it seemed to me, to start with teenage girls, that there was sort of awful stereotypes that were perpetuated in fiction and in society of teenage girls as vapid, as superficial, as sort of these selfie-taking morons, and it was so offensive to me, and I just thought there was so much more interesting stuff to say about girls, particularly the things they're not supposed to feel, like aggression or ambition or desire, and so that's sort of how I found my way in, and that became a way to explore all kinds of female relationships.
Well, having been a teenage girl once, I can tell you, it is like fertile ground.
Yes.
When I'm reading your books, I'm always thinking, like, I know that girl. That girl was, well, I won't say her name, but how does Megan know her also?
That's right, we all know those girls.
Yeah. And I interviewed you when The Fever came out, and I remember you quoted Freud as saying something like, we're all arrested at a certain age, and I'm arrested around 14 or 15. So I didn't ask you then, but I'm going to ask you now in front of all these people.
Yes.
What were you like as a teenager?
Oh boy, that's a great question. I suppose I was bookish, I certainly was, but I do remember I grew up in the Midwest, sort of really all-American girl land, where there really were these expectations, and this was in the 80s, so there really was an idea of girlhood that was very dominant in that era. This is the era of the John Hughes movies, and which actually a welcome relief compared to sort of the more stereotypical version of teenage girls. But I was sort of insatiably curious and fascinated by, I suppose, what we would now say dark things. I liked creepy books, I liked true crime, I liked to have adventures, which is, I think, is most girls at that age. You want out in the world. You're not quite ready for it, but you want it. And what makes it sort of terrifying moment once you're an adult and you have kids of your own, but at that age it feels exactly the right thing.
Yeah. And teenage girl relationships are really important in your novels. How would you describe those relationships when you're in high school?
Yeah, they're girls? Occasionally what they would now call toxic, I suppose. But I think it was very dominant. I mean, all of you who are women in the room know, and I'm sure most of the men know from the women they know, that there can be very volatile friendships at that age. In some ways, they're rehearsals for romances to come, or what you don't want in a relationship, as an adult. So you're kind of figuring out what the boundaries are and what's acceptable, and there's like a lot of passion to it that can be heartbreaking. So many women I know who've read one of my books and we've talked about it, that their first heartbreak was really from a friendship, not from a romantic relationship. But the friendships are somewhat romantic, so that just seems, obviously for a crime novel, that's ripe terrain.
Yeah. And that's very much the case in Fever. But I would love to talk about your last book,
Yes.
You Will Know Me. And I would love for you to read the first page.
Sure. Yes, this is from the point of view of Katie. So Katie is the mother of a gymnast, and this is her, and I don't need to say anything more because it's the first page. If she ever had to talk about it, which she never would, Katie would have to go back years before it happened, before Coach T and Haley and Ryan Beck, back before Devin was born, when there were only 2 Knoxes, neither of whom knew a tuck from a salto or what you called that glossy egg-shaped platform in the center of the room, the vault that would change their lives. And Katie would tell the story in 3 parts: the foot, the fall, the pit. You could only begin to understand what happened and why if you understood those 3 things. And Devin's talent, because that had been there from the beginning, maybe even before the beginning. In proud parent moments, of which there were too many to count, she and Eric would talk about feeling Devin in the womb, her body arching and minnowing and promising itself to them both.
How important is that first page?
So much. It's the part that gets rewritten the most times, and sort of, in this case, weirdly, the first line remained the same, but most everything else I just read changed. Even that footfall pit thing, which becomes the structural device for the first part of the book, came later. First page is really when most readers decide a lot of things. We all know it. I do it too. Sometimes it's because you're in the bookstore and you're looking at the first page, or sometimes you get the sample on your e-reader or whatever it is, and you need to be grabbed. So I always want it to feel very intimate and sort of like a confessional. So that trying to sort of reach out to the reader and, I need to tell you this thing, and that's always what I'm going for on the first page.
Well, it's funny about the first page about sort of confessing, yes, I go to the bookstore, and if you don't have me at that first page, I'm probably not going to buy that book. But I have a 12-year-old son, and the teachers tell the kids now, read the first few pages.
Yeah.
I mean, I think they're not saying, and if you don't like it, put it down. They're saying, if it's just right for your reading level, then
Right.
This is something you should buy. But I think in any form of entertainment, the first few notes of a song, the
Yes.
first words of a book, the first scene in a movie are so important. And I was wondering if it's something that takes longer than everything else.
It is. I mean, and you know it when it's sort of like pornography. You know it when you see it. Like you know it when you're writing and you have it, or you think you do. Like you think you have something that is arresting in some way. And it is a lot like we're in this sort of moment in the culture of oversaturation, and peak TV and, podcasts and all these things. And I think we make a lot of decisions all the time about what we're going to continue with. So that, you want to connect and you want it to feel personal or intimate. And with a crime novel, obviously you want to suggest in some way that something's going to happen, which is what separates us from some other genres, though I love them all.
And for You Will Know Me, where did the story idea come from? And the idea to focus on gymnasts?
Yeah, it was a slow process. I was really interested in prodigy families, and I had read that wonderful Andrew Solomon book from a few years ago called Far From the Tree, which is a nonfiction book about the parents of different kinds of exceptional children. Some were prodigies, some had a disability, some had had committed a crime. There's these range of experiences, but how the families sort of dealt with the child's issue or concern or special talent and how power operated in the family was really interesting. And I landed on gymnastics because I was watching the 2012 Olympics, and I will never forget it. It was the London one, and the gymnastics team was fabulous, of course. And Allie Reisman, who was also on the 2016 team, her parents were watching her perform, and there was this famous viral footage, and they did this again in 2016, where they were watching her do her bar routine, and they were both going like this as her body would turn, and they would go like this, and then they would go, oh, and then they were like, and then at the end when she sort of nailed it, the dad stood up and did this fist pump, and the Boston Proud family, and became so interested in that kind of marriage, when it's both parents are so invested, and so that's how I sort of found Katie and Eric in the book. I wanted to sort of explore what that would be like.
Yeah, well, that, and in many ways, this book is a lot about moms and parents and how they deal with each other, and then they deal with the community that they're in, and the ambitions of this community and individuals. And it's kind of scary because it does mirror some reality, because you think, yes, I've been to that soccer game where the moms are far too invested, and dads. But I am wondering, for you, the gymnastics world, were you a gymnast?
No, yeah, I have no athletic capacity at all, and it's come up in a lot of my books. I've written about cheerleaders. I had a hockey player in The Fever, and I think this is my other Freudian revelation, is that clearly I want to be an athlete, and I'm working it out. Like 14-year-old Megan says, why can't I be good at any of these sports? So even you're short and you can't even do gymnastics. So no, I think for me, anybody who has sort of mastery of their body in some way fascinated me. But gymnastics in particular has this function, they start training so early, serious gymnasts, that it actually can sort of stall their development. Puberty can be delayed, and that seemed fascinating to me for a number of reasons, but not the least of what it's like as a parent to somehow be involved in something that stops your daughter from coming of age. She doesn't get her period. Most gymnasts don't get their period. Sorry for talking about periods on a Saturday afternoon, but they don't get their periods until their 20s. Like everything is stopped, and their body develops differently to accommodate it, and they don't want to get breasts because it will affect the physics of gymnastics. So that just, like, for a writer, of course, that's just so exciting. Yeah. For a person, it's tragic, but
like for audiences, it's great.
Not tragic, but yeah.
And why crime fiction? Why do you think you are so drawn to writing crime novels?
Yeah, I think about that a lot. I mean, some crime writers are very much interested in the procedural elements, which I am as a reader, but not as a writer, because my mind doesn't work. My books don't have like a series of clues. I mean, there are clues sort of, but it's not like the Agatha Christie or or Nancy Drew or any of the sort of classic ones. But I do like sort of people in crisis, how they handle it and how they respond, and people kind of reckoning with their own darkness or the darkness of those they love. That just endlessly fascinates me. So I was really the kid who, and so many crime novelists I know have had the same experience, that you would be in the used bookstore and you're like 10 years old and there's Helter Skelter and you open it and you want to look at the pictures, which is grotesque, but there's a curiosity that you have to get comfortable with in yourself. And also know what its limits are too, so that it doesn't become indulgent or sensational.
Yeah. And then with your process, do you come up with the crime first and then build the world and the characters around it? Or what's your...
It's usually the character first in the situation. Sometimes I have a crime and then I'm trying to find the character I'm trying to match make. And then that's a little harder. Almost always it's have a character and then I'm sort of searching for a crime. And it's often a real life case like The Fever, or in this case it wasn't a crime, but a real life inspiration, but I start with character. If I can't nail the voice of the character, then it's the wrong story. So that has to be, I've had many false starts. Every book there's been 2 or 3 false starts before I find the one. Yeah. So.
I don't know how many people know about The Fever, but that it really was drawn from a true story. If you want to talk about that a little bit.
Yes, some of you may remember it, but there was this famous case of, I guess it was about 5 years ago now, in upstate New York of these young girls, all of whom developed these tics, these motor tics, and it sort of spread through the school. It was a very small town, and it became this sort of phenomenon. And there, Aaron Brockovich arrived. They thought maybe it was environmental. Other people thought there was some kind of Lyme disease. There were all these theories about it, and in the end, it was primarily diagnosed as this psychogenic illness, this kind of hysteria. So the symptoms were real, but it came from a psychological place. So that just, I mean, that was just, it felt like it was right in my wheelhouse. It was calling to me, write about me. So.
It was right. I mean, maybe it was planned. I mean, because it was a Megan Abbott novel in the making, for sure, for sure. Tell me a little bit more about your process and your day. When do you write? What's the best time of day for you to write? And
yeah, I have to write. I have to sort of block out the day. So I tend to be most productive in the morning, but I don't write. I don't just sit down and do my 2 hours. I'm not fast enough or proficient or organized, a thinker enough. So I just basically write on and off all day in these sort of spurts between, the distract. I mean, now we have the last 8 months or so, there's been so many distractions with the world. It's been much, I've talked to so many writers across genre that the distraction of the news has been, and the sort of we need to follow the news has made it harder, but I do try to block that out, and I have these sort of spurts. In the last few years, I've done some TV writing, and that's a different motor. Like, I can turn that on at any time and plug in. It's much faster because it's not as interior, but so I was really aware of how important the novel writing process for me, that I don't sort of just plug in, that I really try to sit in that world, imagine the characters, and just sort of, it's sort of like going into cold water bit by stage by stage by stage.
Yeah. And I heard you say once that you really can't sort of have lunch and sort of pull yourself away from the atmosphere, because then you're completely derailed.
It's true, and people get annoyed and they think I'm being so precious. But let's have lunch, and I say, can we have dinner instead, or can we? Because if we have lunch, then I will sit at lunch and I will probably order a beer or something I should never would normally do, because no, I don't have to go back to work now, and I have the rest of the day off. I can't get in that head again because I'm in the social head, and it's impossible to get back in.
Yeah. Are there real stories going on in the world right now that you're watching and thinking, that's my next novel?
Yeah, I have a few on my ticker now, and I'm sort of following them. People now send me them all the time, which is great. There was, I shouldn't even say it because maybe I'll write about it, but there was this great case last year of these twin yoga teachers, and one of them killed the other one on a Hawaiian cliff. She drove the car off the cliff, and then it turned out they had this very weird relationship, and it's fascinating. And I think 30 or 40 people sent me that article when it came out. You gotta write about this. Or the teenage girl who texted her boyfriend and then he killed himself, which is a terrible story. And actually, I wouldn't write about that. You make these decisions. That one felt very upsetting to me, and I didn't want to write it. But a lot of people sent me that too. Yeah, so in fact, another writer I know actually emailed me yesterday to say, "Are you going to write about it? Because I might." This is weird. And I said, "No, go. You got to go ahead."
Yeah. Just don't make it a hit.
That's right. No, that's right. And I wouldn't. It is weird with decisions we make about, because when you write a novel, it takes me like a year and a half maybe to write a novel, sometimes a little more, and so you're living in this space for a while, and there's certain spaces that I just know I don't want to live in for that long. It's too unpleasant. And I don't have any co-pilots that feel right. Like with You Will Know Me, there was characters I liked, and I knew I would be comfortable with them. And then I would go, like Katie, I liked Katie. Once I figured out how I liked her, then I could go with her.
Tell us about Katie.
Katie, she's, I was really resistant to doing a kind of classic stage mom, even though in some ways, from the outside, she could be viewed as a stage mom. So I really wanted her to be someone who had no plan for her daughter to be anything but her daughter. But her daughter had this special talent. And then early on in the book, very early, so it's not a spoiler, but I won't go into it, there's something that happens to Devin when she's a little girl that increases Katie's worry for her and protectiveness of her and her wanting to make everything right for her. And so I think she really thinks she's doing the right thing by Devin. And in many ways she is, but I think it also can be when you're in these communities, these sports communities or music communities or whatever the special talent is, can be really hard to keep perspective because everyone you know is also in that world and you have no barometer, you have no way to measure it. And I think that Katie does get a little lost in that. But I wanted it to feel like that she was coming from a good space so that we would follow her there.
I love when the mothers say to her, "What's your secret? What are you guys feeding her? That I'll feed my daughter so she'll be just as successful." And that, yeah, it was I do think that there's some of that goes on, that the parents are thinking all they have to do is tweak the appetite or the schedule, and it's really hard on kids, I think.
I think so too.
The parents' expectations can be very debilitating for the kids, I think.
So true. There's, it's almost like they're talking about horse race when they do that. Like, what's the diet, but this is our horse, our show horse, we're competing. But there's another part of it that a lot of prodigies or just very talented young athletes, they do want it very badly. But I think it's very hard to tell the part. And sometimes they want it very badly. My brother was a very intense baseball player as a kid, and my parents were very involved, and we went to all the Little League games, and I was the kid sitting in the stands, bored to tears, because the games would last forever, and my parents were really motivated, but at a certain point he lost interest. He was 14. Other things started to seem interesting to him, but luckily he felt comfortable enough saying it, and they felt fine, I think, with not surrendering their summers to baseball anymore. But
wait a second. So you're Drew.
I'm Drew. There's a little brother.
You've read it.
I am definitely
You were doing the
Drew.
science experiments.
Yes, I was the bookish one, and my brother's fairly bookish too. But he was a really good athlete, and I was never, as stated, was never the athlete I wanted to be. Yeah. So I was, I did see it from the outside, so I had a little more perspective. The little brother in the book, I think, is the only one in the family who kind of really sees what's going on, even though he's quite young.
I also noticed that technology, social media, which has so revolutionized what it's like to be a teenager right now, this milieu you don't engage in that a lot. And I'm wondering if, as a writer, if you grapple with that, given that teenagers are who you really like to...
Yes, no, I think about that a lot. It's sort of, I got a free pass with this because Devin doesn't really have friendships because she doesn't have many peer relationships, so that's not part of her experience. It's somewhat a part of the fever, but the book I wrote before that, Dare Me, which is about the cheerleading squad, if I wrote that now, so that came out in 2012, there's some texting and social media in it, but if I wrote it now, I would have to write it completely differently. Because it's become, since when I wrote it was 2010, so in the past 8 years, every 7 years, there's been so much, become so much a function of it. But there is something deadly about reading text messages in a novel, because if your text messages are anything like mine, they are not very literary, and they're filled with emojis and things that, that can just, that's not why we read. On the other hand, if used effectively, I think they can be a tool. The way we're so attached to our phone now, and I'm a victim of this, not just teenagers, right? We all know it, where your phone, you so used to having it in your hand or on your person, you're always looking for it. You feel those false vibrations that they say some of us feel, and that can be useful in a crime novel because, of course, it adds this sort of nerve-wracking element, of this sort of. They've used it sometimes as well on TV and movies too, that jolt, of the phone. This phone is like a living thing.
Yeah. Do you, because I know you talk to teenagers a lot as part of your research, right? Talk to gymnasts or cheerleaders or whoever. Do you sense that you're understanding them as much as you've always considered you want to understand teenagers since you're arrested in that age? Or is it now becoming a real cultural shift for what they're like? And
yeah, boy, that's a good question. I mean, I think there's certain eternals. There's certain things that I'm never going to get, and I don't pretend to. And sometimes I'll go on, say, Tumblr or something, because sometimes they'll be on Tumblr. It's a big teenage girl space, or at least was as of last week. And so because sometimes they'll tag one of my books, right? So I'll go there, and I don't even know what I'm looking at, and they do book trailers for your book, it's wild, and there's these images, and there's this slang I don't know, and so I really do try to keep up, but there's a lot of stuff that I know I do not have access to. On the other hand, there are so many eternals, the friendship element is the same. That sense of being on the precipice and seeking more, that sense of, I think for teenage girls now, you're both have all this power and no power at all. I think that's always there. So I try to, in the book, stick to those things and not rely on the more ephemeral elements. I've been developing my novel Dare Me for TV, and I've had to keep changing all the cultural references with each stage of development, because it goes on forever. So you're rewriting the script, and I have to take this Rihanna thing out because, that is no longer a teenage thing, I mean, for some speak teenage, but the cultural references just date immediately. And in a book, you really don't want to do that if you can avoid it.
So you are writing for HBO's The Deuce.
Yes.
And that's really exciting. I haven't seen it yet because I don't think
it hasn't. Yeah, it premieres next weekend.
Right.
Yeah.
But as I understand it, another great crime novelist, George Pelecanos, who I adore, is
DC proud, right?
DC proud. That's right. DC. Go DC's in the house. How did it come about?
So it's David Simon, who's still fairly local. Some of you may know The Wire, and George Pelecanos developed the project together. It's called The Deuce. It's set in 1970s Times Square, and it's about the birth of the porn industry in Times Square at that moment, and they were looking for crime writers to add to the cast. There's crime elements in the show, but I don't know. I think David Simon and George Pelecanos, George as a crime novelist, but they both tend to work with crime novels. So Richard Price is also in the writer's room, and Dennis Lehane, of course, famously wrote on The Wire. So they like to have crime writers, and because of the pornography subject, I think they thought we need some women. So I knew George pretty well, and I knew David a little bit through his wife, the great crime novelist Laura Lippman. So they asked if I would be interested, and of course, it was between David Simon, Pelecanos, and Price, it was sort of the holy trinity of crime fiction, so there was no way I was going to say no. So I would have done anything for it. I would have done it for free if the Writers Guild would let me. But thankfully they didn't, so I actually got paid.
Well, we have 15 minutes left, and we'd love to hear some questions from people out there.
Hi.
Hi.
As a huge sports fan, a graduate of Notre Dame, a fellow Midwesterner, as also a parent of a daughter and two sons who all played competitive sports, I really want to thank you for really ripping the scab off of the predatory nature of specialized sports and youth. I think it's really gone way too far. I actually refuse to let any of my kids do individual sports because I said the only value of sports is learning to be a good team player. And I was wondering if you interviewed any of the any gymnasts from Bella, specifically any of the members of the 2008 gymnastics team, which Sports Illustrated did a huge article, and it was fascinating. None of those women will let any of their daughters do gymnastics. They say, no way.
There has. Thank you. Thank you so much for your question and your kind words. Yes, there's been quite a gymnastics scandal since the book, but it was already there. A lot of gymnasts, so the sort of coaches who were predating on gymnasts, and it's sort of slowly unfolded over a long time, and it was somehow covered up, as all these stories we keep hearing are. And that was something that came up a lot, not in the interviews I did, but in the in the sort of exposés that had been written, even in the memoirs, a lot of former gymnasts had written about it, but nobody had really covered it, and no one saw it as an institutional problem or a systemic problem. But I didn't interview any of Bella. He's a very famous gymnastics coach and famously abusive, not sexually, but a mean guy. I didn't interview any of his gymnasts, though I did interview a gymnast whose sister had trained with him. And I interviewed some gymnasts who had had very intense training experiences and had been homeschooled, which a lot of them are, and could really speak to a lot of the weird body issues developed, but also it was a good balance because a lot of them spoke to how wonderful the sport was for them and what it did for them and making them feel powerful and strong at a young age. There's so many positives to it that it makes it doubly a shame when these other elements sort of, take that away from the kids doing it and from the parents who are just enjoying it and being supportive. So, I mean, like anything, it has a dark side, but gymnastics in particular, its dark side has really reared its ugly head of late.
Yeah.
Hi.
Sorry.
This is more of a process question. You were saying how if somebody wants you to take a break that you can't get back into it, but do you ever have times where you're done writing for the day, but then an idea comes to you and you're just like, oh, I have to go back and write this now?
Yes, I do. Thankfully, those are the best moments. It's sort of the muse takes over. Yes, it's often when I've moved away from the computer, the ideas immediately come. Because I think we do get stuck in our. Do you write? We get stuck in our tunnels, and I think it can be very hard. I'll take a walk, and I'll be walking, and I will figure out the whole plot problem, or I'll what the character needs to say, and often I'll do this. I used to write it down in a little notebook. I still have the notebook in my purse, but now I'll actually send an email to myself. I'll punch it out. And I have this weird thing that's happened is that there's someone that has an email address exactly mine, a Gmail address, and there's only one difference in our address, and so occasionally she gets emails that are supposed to be for me, and occasionally she gets emails that I think I'm emailing to myself. And sometimes they're really violent, and she gets it because she knows I'm a crime novelist now, but at first she was really frightened because it would be like, she should take the knife right now. So we have a good relationship.
Thank you.
She does crew, and occasionally I get emails about, she actually lives in D.C. It would be great if she were here today, but Megan?
Hi, so you were talking earlier about how sick you were of this sort of reductive mean girl stereotype when it comes to the writing of teenage girls. How do you balance that so that when you write them, you're able to make them sort of complex, flawed people who make questionable choices, but people's takeaway isn't, wow, teenage girls are really bitchy?
Right. That's exactly it. It's a tricky part. I think part of it is, it's sort of like in crime fiction, there's the femme fatale character, right, who's the lethal lady. And I was always interested when I read classic crime fiction, what the book would be like if it were written from their point of view, in which case everything would be different, right? And we would sympathize with the femme fatale, and we would understand her motives for making the guy kill her husband and whatever she's making them do. And I think it's a similar thing with Mean Girls, only they're much less lethal. But I really do try to view things from their point of view, and that I've always, and this is perhaps speaks more to my high school experience, but that it was always really like a battlefield, and the strong survive, and there is a Lord of the Flies element for a lot of us, and that in some ways the armor that the Mean Girls wear is because of the circumstance they're in, and it's and girls can be really hard on each other in ways that are not obvious, and they're not socialized to express certain feelings, whereas boys may get in a fist fight or something. It's not the way girls are supposed to be, so it becomes very complicated. So I try to sort of put all that into perspective. Then usually what happens, so in my book Dare Me, I have sort of what people often call my classic mean girl if they are looking at that trope and looking at my books. And her name is Beth. And she's my favorite character, and I grew to love her so much by the end of the book, even though I intended her to be the antagonist in some way, that I actually changed the whole plot so that she would have a more sympathetic place in the story, and I just grew to love her. So I try to really view that as my role, is to love them.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Even though other people hate her.
I guess speaking of my question was actually about Dare Me, and this is kind of a spoiler for the end of the book, but
Oh yeah, so anyone close their ears if they don't want spoilers.
so I guess I was just sort of wondering what your thinking was about the fact that Beth and the main character had this sexual relationship, and in what sense do you think that informed their sort of lift?
Yeah. That to me was always there, and it was just a question of how when to reveal it. But I guess what we were talking about before, of these intense female friendships that often border on romance and sometimes are, and sometimes they're this space in between, and you don't really know. And in some ways, one of the things I love most about the millennials is that all these sort of strict divisions that my generation had in terms of gay, straight, male, female, very we knew what we were, that there was no space in between. That's really kind of, in large part, gone. And I wanted the book to be in that space where this definitely explained a lot of the intensity of their relationship, but it didn't define them, and it wasn't meant to be this is why this all happened. It was meant to show how truly emotionally involved with one another they were, and how deep it went. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
So many of your earlier books focused on this noir universe.
Yes.
And I'm curious if you missed that universe at all, and also how that shaped the way that you write about current day.
Yes. My first 4 books are all sort of historical, more classic noir, inspired by film noir, and the femme fatale. It's sort of viewing the femme fatale from the inside was sort of the way I approached those books. And I really love. I started writing those books because I love the mid-century, last century, 30s, 40s, 50s America. And I do miss that. That's mostly what I have done short stories in, is sort of my outlet for it. But I do hope to go back to it someday. I think the carryover is that, weirdly, those noir novels are at a very high pitch. They're very Baroque and big, and it was very easy to go into writing teenage girl world from that world. It felt like it was a perfect match. I didn't have to step down at all, and it kind of feels the same to me. The thing I miss is getting to talk about the clothes and the nightclubs and the racetracks, and that I miss. It's the suburban life is not as compelling, so I try to give texture to that, and that's kind of one way how I know I'm into a book. Like the gym world, once I've had enough sort of visceral stuff to hang on to, and the details of it, and the body stuff, then that sort of is a substitution for the great clothes.
Well, now you've got HBO, we've got the whole visual porn industry, I guess.
That's right. That's right.
Hi, Megan. I loved You All Know Me, and so
Thank you.
Goodreads tells me you have something coming out in 2018, and I just wondered if you can give us any sense of what we have to look forward to with that.
Thank you. They have a book coming out. I think it's going to be next July. It's called Give Me Your Hand, and it's about 2 female scientists who really became interested in the role of women in science, and it's still so much the minority in so many of the scientists, and so it's very much a male universe still by and large, and so this is about 2 female scientists who share a secret, and then lots of bad stuff happens. So it's, I guess I sort of wanted to do something a little more Hitchcockian. So the lab is sort of, to me, a fascinating and creepy and beautiful space. So that was sort of the inspiration behind that, and what it was like for women working in that world then becomes a kind of sub-story.
I think we only have a couple of minutes left, but I did want to find out, there's a book that's always on your shelf with the word psychic in the title.
Oh, yes, there is How to Defend Yourself Against Psychic Attacks, which is...
This is the book that's always on her shelf.
Which makes me sound crazy in parting, but a friend of mine, another crime novelist, Sarah Gran, gave me that book because we get very superstitious. Writers in general, I think, are very superstitious, like athletes, and with like good energy around a book seemed really important. And so she gave me this book, which is sort of ward off, and she also gave me a voodoo sort of bag of these charms, and I've had other friends that have given, I also do prayer candles. It's crazy, but it's not that I do or don't believe in psychic attacks, but having the book there, everything's gone okay. In my personal life, at least in my writing life, has gone okay since then. So I'm keeping the book there until things turn.
Well, Megan Abbott, thank you. Thank you
you
very much.
Thank
Really
you so
great.
much. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.